life is important to everyone, whether one is a Christian, whether one is a Muslim, whether one is a non-believer.
Pro-life attitudes on a continent where Catholicism is rapidly advancing. We continue our exploration of abortion around the globe. This week, Africa.
It is very shocking. It is very sad, especially if we think about those who have been harmed in the church, by church personnel, by clergy and non-clergy, by those who should have protected them, should have led them on to the faith.
Abuse within the church. Why did it happen? And why does it continue to happen? A leading Vatican expert on the church sex abuse crisis shares his insights.
I was really struck that I was not seeing in more legal contests involving Catholic institutions wanting to feel free about hiring and firing employees.
Law professor and author Helen Alvarado talks about how the church can respond to the many challenges it faces. She joins us on the record. And the faith of a queen, a final goodbye to a monarch whose bedrock foundation on earth was her devotion to our Maker. EWTN News In Depth starts now.
It's just this Western idea that, children are our baggage, children are expensive, and that is what is bringing in this change. But traditionally, children we've always thought of them as a blessing.
A culture of life in Africa. Before Western influences, a tradition of celebrating children and the rejection of abortion. Here in the U.S., we've been intensely focused on the issue of abortion, especially since the Supreme Court ruling in the Dobbs case this summer. But the topic of abortion also sparks deeply emotional responses around the globe, as different cultures and religious influences impact the laws governing the fate of the unborn. We look at abortion policies in Latin America last week and continue now with a look at attitudes toward abortion in Africa. News In Depth reporter Mark Irons tells us about the growing Catholic population there and their strong pro-life values.
During a trip to Africa in 1995, a future saint made a profound statement. Pope John Paul II said, "The peoples of Africa respect the life which is conceived and born. They rejoice in this life. They reject the idea that it can be destroyed, even when the so-called progressive civilizations would like to lead them in this direction."
Culturally, we value life, and we look at children as a blessing, as a sign of prosperity.
Dr. Joki Fernandez is an obstetrician and gynecologist from Nairobi, Kenya. Her office is connected to a Catholic shrine in the African country where she gives medical care from a Catholic point of view. But she says in Africa, it's not just the Catholic Church or faith-based groups that protect unborn life, it's the culture.
Yes, we fiercely protect our own, and we really look after our children.
Fernandez describes a continent that is generally opposed to abortion.
In Africa, yes, we are very accepting of life, and we celebrate new life, and women who are expectant are very highly revered, because you're carrying life.
Take a look at the laws. There are more than 50 countries in Africa. According to the Center for Reproductive Rights, only 5 allow abortion on request, and even some of those have gestational limits. But the vast majority of African countries ban or restrict abortion. There are some exceptions for things like rape, incest, and protecting the life or health of the mother, but compared with other regions around the world, Africa has far greater abortion restrictions on the books.
In my country, Nigeria, abortion is illegal.
And on one global stage, Africa is taking a stand for life. At the United Nations General Assembly in New York this month, a resolution passed defining abortion as an international human right. It was supported by more than 80 countries around the world, including the U.S. and members of the European Union. But the proposal was objected by a number of African countries led by Nigeria.
We should not be creating new rights in international law. Abortion is a subject to be dealt with exclusively in national legislation.
Listening to Africans, you may find abortion advocacy isn't homegrown on their continent. It's coming in from outside.
We're not happy when there's a conspiracy from the West
A practicing lawyer in Nigeria, Sonny Ekwuosi is active in the country's pro-life movement as a director of the Foundation for African Cultural Heritage. He led efforts earlier this year to protest an abortion directive proposed by the government in Lagos, a state in Nigeria. The directive was ultimately suspended by the governor in Lagos, but Ekwuosi says it received backing from Marie Stopes International, a pro-abortion organization with headquarters in London, and the Population Reference Bureau, a nonprofit with headquarters in Washington, D.C. Ekwuosi says the promotion of abortion in Africa is planted by the West, an abortion agenda.
When we get this message from the West, we are surprised that, that they are trying to impose something strange on us, because culturally speaking, it doesn't conform to our culture.
His words sound similar to what Pope St. John Paul II said, and something Pope Francis has spoken out against: ideological colonization, a phrase the Pope has used to describe Western secular principles being imposed on developing nations around the world. And he has vocally opposed abortion throughout his papacy. The Holy Father has made multiple trips to Africa. The Catholic faith is growing rapidly on the continent. But Dr. Joki Fernandez warns there is no guarantee pro-life values will stay rooted.
Slowly, with the newer generation of educated Africans, then we're getting this acceptance of abortion, but something that was not imagined, a few years ago.
She believes globalization and social media continue to introduce anti-life concepts to younger generations. But hope remains. The Catholic Church in Africa is active in healthcare and in education, two areas that Fernandez and Ekwuosi believe impact the culture, one that historically has valued life conceived.
We remain strongly pro-life because it's in the culture of the people.
Mark Irons, EWTN News In Depth.
Joining us to continue the discussion on pro-life efforts in Africa is Obianuju Ekocha, founder and president of Culture of Life Africa, an initiative dedicated to the promotion of the gospel of life in Africa. Obianuju, you talk about ideological colonization. We just heard about that in our package in your pro-life work. Tell us more about what that means, this push for abortion in Africa.
Yeah, so it's quite a phenomenon and quite surprising, because this is the age of information and most things happening. We have witnesses around the world with social media, but no one seems to be talking about it. That Western countries, especially the countries that are the so-called donor nations to African nations, those who give them money, those who give them funding and aid, humanitarian aid, and even sometimes that private citizens and private foundations like the Gates Foundation, they come to African countries to offer some help, supposedly, but then they also have their own demands and their own requests. And most times it would have to do with ideology and culture, and especially things that have to do with pushing abortion, pushing contraception, population control, and things like that. So it's a kind of a carrot and stick technique which the Western donors use to approach African countries, and it's really frustrating.
A carrot and stick approach. That's really interesting. A lot of money is funneled into Africa, like you were saying, for reproductive health rights from wealthy donors in the West. The COVID-19 pandemic then brought even more funds to Africa and to countries around the world. Has there been an increase in this push for contraceptive and abortion funding as well?
Oh, most definitely, especially because during the time of the COVID pandemic, if anyone would remember, most people around the world were rightly so concerned about what was happening in their own countries, the shutdowns, the limitations, the loss of freedoms and the loss of businesses and so on and so forth that was happening in countries. So no one was really looking at what was happening between Africa and those nations, again, and those donors, those entities that are coming with their own demands. But then what happened under the kind of protection of the darkness of COVID era was that the abortion organizations used it to gain a lot of grounds. They were pushing for more activism on abortion. And it's very ironic because during the COVID pandemic, we're supposedly indoors. So it was incredible to see more push for abortion laws or abortion legalization through African countries. There was more push for all kinds of resolutions at the United Nations level. We saw a lot of that. And I think they used the fact that no one was really paying attention to push so much more that abortion should be brought in as a kind of international right.
Obianuju, you're from Nigeria. a very pro-life country that took the lead in defending the unborn at the United Nations just a couple of weeks ago. But we see a lot of religious persecution there too, especially of Christians and Catholics. Is the Catholic Church very involved in the pro-life movement there, or is it not safe enough to be doing that?
Okay, so I've been doing pro-life work now, I'd say for the last decade or so, very actively. And I would say that at the beginning of my pro-life activism, in the sense of speaking, there was so much that was done around Nigeria. There were many places where, for example, pro-life conferences, March for Life campaigns were done back in 2015, 2016. We had and we saw so many activities around the country. But since things have been very difficult in my country, I'd say it's been much harder for bishops and for people within the Catholic Church in Nigeria to be able to pay attention to do pro-life activities. And you can say that, people are still afraid of their lives. There's so much insecurity, more than we've ever seen it in my own lifetime, that people feel so unsafe that they can't even come out for regular things, or people are afraid to come out for regular things. What more, these extra activities? So there's been a hard hit on pro-life activities and pro-life efforts around the country, but still the Nigerian people are still very pro-life and still value human life. And I think even now, maybe recognize so much more, like the value of every human life.
That's exactly right. So these shared values on the pro-life issue in Nigeria, could they potentially be a model for bridge building between various tribes or religions, bringing people together under this one umbrella?
We had that before. It was quite easy for me to work, for example, with a lot of our Muslim politicians, with a lot of our Muslim delegates at the UN. It didn't matter whether one was Christian or Muslim. I knew that when I was talking to a Nigerian, I was talking to a pro-life person. So we've already had that. And we had great success in trying to use pro-life work to get through and get across to people, irrespective of whatever anyone believes. But, we all believe that every life should be protected. So at this time, I think it's something that is still there, kind of in the background, but it's one that we need to reemphasize and keep reemphasizing, that no matter what is happening, we still have at least these common grounds where we know for sure that we have the same beliefs and the same passions, which would have to do with protecting human life at every cost.
That's right. And in protecting human life, for a lot of people, maternal mortality is something that they think about often. Sub-Saharan Africa has some of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world. Yes. And many pro-abortion advocates then believe that the answer is more access to contraceptives and more access to abortion. What is your response to that? What's that pro-life solution there?
It's very unfortunate because I have, of course, been born and raised in Africa, in Nigeria particularly, but I have lived for the last almost 20 years in Europe. And I know that what our ideological or ideologue donors are not offering us is what they have in Europe and America. It's the excellent medical facility, the excellent medical care. What is it that has made women's lives much better here in Europe? It's not abortion. It's not even contraception. It's the fact that they have top-notch medical services. They're doing everything they can to improve the medical services. They continue to improve, but they're not offering us any of this, and they're telling us this approach, giving abortion, giving contraception is what you need in order to reduce maternal mortality. And that is a blatant lie. I've worked within the healthcare system here in the United Kingdom, and I know for a fact that what we need in Africa and what is making a difference here in Europe, it's not abortion. It's all the things that they're not offering us, which is really, all the excellence that can be cultivated within a healthcare system. And they're not giving that to us, and they're not even offering it at all.
Well, that's a real call to action, creating the conditions for women to be able to choose for themselves what they want and how to keep their children. Thank you so much, Obianuju.
Thank you.
There's much more ahead on this edition of EWTN News In Depth. Next, one of the most difficult controversies that the Catholic Church has ever had to deal with: sexual abuse and cover-ups. We'll have insights from one of the Vatican's leading victim advocates.
This is something that we need to realize, that we cannot compare ourselves to a sports club or a public school or the Scouts of America. We are the Catholic Church. We are supposed to be and preach that we are merciful, that we are loving, and that we do the best to other people.
Sexual abuse in the church. An expert on the psychology of abuse talks to our Colin Flynn, his fears of what might still be uncovered. And a life well lived. Images from earlier this week as the world said goodbye to a towering figure whose life embodied her faith in God. EWTN News In Depth. We'll be right back. Over the past several decades, clergy sex abuse cases have rocked the Catholic Church, revealing the Church's frequent failures to protect the most vulnerable. In 2014, the Vatican established a department to oversee the safeguarding of children called the Pontifical Mission for the Protection of Minors. EWTN News In Depth recently had an opportunity to speak with one of its leading voices, Father Hans Zollner. A theologian and psychologist, he's been studying the phenomenon of clergy abuse for more than 30 years. He spoke with correspondent Colin Flynn.
Now, I know it is such a complicated issue and topic, and we don't have a lot of time to discuss it, but when we look at abuse within the Catholic Church, from your studies over the decades, why did it happen and what allowed it, do you think, to continue to happen? What were some of the main factors?
Now, abuse happens when people are in positions of power and they exercise that power by means of any kind of violence. And in our case, if we talk about sexual abuse against minors, it is sexual violence. So for whatever reason, and there are many, clergy and non-clergy abuse their power, abuse the trust with which people encounter them, children, youth, and their parents and their friends and their teachers, and they abuse sexually, they satisfy their own sexual desires, but also other desires like closeness, like feeling important in other person's lives, like dominating others. Unfortunately, this is present in all human beings and also in clergy. And why it continued is the other question, and maybe even the more important, because in human beings there is evil, and we sin and we commit crimes, even if there are commandments and even if there are laws. And you will never eradicate that, you will never abolish it completely. However, we could do, and we could have done much more in the Church by following up on those allegations properly, by committing to the laws of the Church and of the state or the governments respectively, and to stop shifting people around who have abused and of whom bishops and provincials of religious congregations knew what they had done. But this did not happen, and I honestly believe that there is a danger that this is still going on.
Some people, I've heard them say, in the Church, out of the Church as well, that the issue is close to being resolved. The Church has been dealing with it over the past number of years, facing up to the reality and confronting their sins. But when you look at large parts of the world, Brazil and Africa and Asia, we're not hearing as many stories of scandals coming out of there. And as you just alluded to, that you suspect that maybe cover-ups are still going on there today.
Yeah, I fear that this is not only true for African or Asian countries, or Latin American for that matter. I fear that this is still in some parts, for example, of Europe, and even Northern America going on. However, I got reports recently from one Asian country in particular, where the Catholic population is a minority, as almost everywhere in Asia, but a sizable minority. And I heard shocking reports about what is going on there in terms of how priests live with youth that they train to become then themselves seminarians and later on priests, probably. And nobody is supervising them. And you can only imagine what in some places, not everywhere of course, but in some places, we will still hear about abuse committed by clergy and religious. And unfortunately, this is far from over. And I would warn everybody who thinks that this is done with. In the North American, in the Western European or Northern European area, Central European, we are fed up with it because it's stuck with us for 30, 40, 20 years. However, in other parts of the world, we have not yet started to talk about it.
From your studies, you discovered that the average age of a priest who abuses is 39. Why that age, do you think?
Probably, in all probability, there are many factors, and one is the one that I mentioned earlier, that people come into positions of power and they are at the same time also somehow empty or growing empty in their own spirituality, in their own rootedness in their ministry. They get fed up, they are frustrated because life is approaching, and they are looking for their satisfaction. And one reason why they abuse is that with minors of age, you think you will get away with it easily. You can threaten them, you can dominate them, you can exercise your power more easily than with an adult person. And so one of the reasons is that you can abuse of them in a way that you think you will not be discovered so easily.
You think that you're untouchable?
And this is one of the things that is connected also with the culture in the Catholic Church, that priests have been considered untouchable and still are in some areas of the world like that.
And when we look at civil law, canon law, and then one's own responsibility morally, ethically as a Christian, has there been this kind of culture and thinking in the Church, some priests and nuns thinking, I'm accountable to nobody, I'm only accountable to God?
Yeah, this is at the bottom of the behavior of many within the Church, not only clergy, I have to say, that because you belong to the Church, to the people of God, and you are responsible only to God, you can forget about and disregard all the other levels of supervision, of law, and of accountability within the Church and outside the Church. And these institutional factors is something that we at our Safeguarding Institute at the Pontifical Gregorian University are now investigating also in greater depth.
This topic is very complex, and the Church has wrestled with it for so long. This interview is just an excerpt of a much longer conversation touching on many aspects of the problem, including what happens to those priests found guilty of crimes against the vulnerable.
In most cases, I believe those who continue being priests have a right for some support by the Church. Of course, that is quite limited, but it is not as if you can just cast out people, even if they are criminals, even if they are the worst criminals in the world. You have to take care of them. That is also some part of the responsibility of the Church.
You can watch Column's full interview with Father Zollner on the EWTN News In Depth Facebook page. It's a conversation full of insights from an expert who has studied this difficult issue for years. The St. Luke Institute in Maryland provides mental health treatment and spiritual care for clergy dealing with a range of issues, from addiction to trauma. Father David Sonji, its president and CEO, he joins us now to provide more context on this topic. Father David, thank you for joining us. We just heard part of an interview with Father Zollner at the Vatican, who said that casting out priests who commit sexual abuse is not an option. Can you discuss where the responsibility of the Church lies in caring for these priests?
Yeah, you have two different situations that the Church looks at. And the first are those who are older and really don't have the means to take care of themselves. That's generally the ones that the Church will say, well, they do what they call prayer and penance, where they're still cared for by the Church. And that's because they're too old to begin some other type of work or to care for themselves. And most don't have the financial means because they've been working at a very low salary for a long time. But when it comes to the younger ones who engage in this type of behavior and it's discovered, in that case, normally the Church will try to remove them from the priestly status because they realize that these people need to move on in their life and they're not able to take care of them for a long period of time. So it's still important to show mercy to them in the sense of mercy is different than saying it's okay. Mercy is saying, okay, we understand that this is what you've done. You're sorry for it, but there are consequences. So you live according to those consequences. And and that means for the younger ones that they need to move out of the priesthood.
And that definition of mercy is so important. Of course, victims of abuse, they suffer greatly. What is the church doing to care for them?
That's really difficult. I've seen many different approaches over time. I've been looking at this for a long time, and there have been efforts to include them in decisions regarding what's done with priests, efforts to offer them, for example, counseling or other resources, to somehow offer some type of compensation, although that's impossible. But the other thing is the church needs to respect them as they are. In other words, we need to offer them help, but we can't continue to control the situation. That was a problem in the first place if a priest exerts too much power. So it really requires that the church be humble in dealing with these people. And this is just, it's been very touchy. How do we do that in a good way? Sometimes we have victims assistants, and what they do is they will accompany these people. So their role is not to be on the side of arguing for the church about whether this is true or not, or just or not. Rather, they're just there for the victims. So often there'll be a victims coordinator or who's available to the person. And there are other roles like that where they say, let's have someone who's independent of the church decision makers who can be available to these people. And we've also improved in looking at forms of treatment that can be offered to people. But in the end, it's their decision what they're going to do. And the church needs to be very humble in trying and recognizing it needs to keep rethinking this.
It's an issue that is going to take a lot of time to understand, and we'll have different solutions as you were describing. Let's talk about the screening process for accepting men into seminaries and training for religious life. What changes have been made in the wake of the sex abuse scandals? Are those changes across the board or vary by diocese?
Well, the Bishops' Conference put together a document on admissions into the seminary that involved psychological testing back in 2014. And this emphasized that these areas needed to be looked at. Essentially, we're asking more questions and doing some screening regarding a person's sexual history and interest. We ask very direct questions. So the protocols have become more normal. I've been doing this testing for a long time. And 15 years ago, there were many different protocols. In other words, many different processes for assessing people. But now there's a whole list of tests that most of us will give. Now, I need to point out that testing really cannot predict whether or not a person is going to abuse. So what's more important is looking at, are there underlying it's usually a personality disorder that'll lead to this kind of behavior. Are there indications of a high level of narcissism? And also, if people have more serious mental illness, especially someone who's, let's say, bipolar, sometimes people who are depressed might engage in behaviors that are not good like this. Also, people who are addicted. So we look for things that could lead to abuse, but it's hard to actually predict who's going to abuse. And as Father Zollner said, if the average age of doing this is 39, that's almost like 15, 20 years after the initial psychological assessment.
People change and they grow. Can there actually be a cure? You work in treatment. This is something that you've seen, and people hope for that. They're reintroduced into ministry. Is there a cure?
So this is often misunderstood. So pedophilia itself is something that they say is probably not curable. Now, the American Psychological Association only came to that conclusion, let's say 10 years ago or so. 20 years ago, they weren't as sure. So that's not curable, but many people who abuse children, they're not pedophiles per se, but they're people who have done this. And so to diagnose this is very difficult. So if it's caused by personality disorder, and that's usually what we see in priests who do this kind of offense, if it's a personality disorder, that's much harder to cure. So what we really need to evaluate each situation and make a recommendation. If a person's abused a minor, the recommendation is never go back to ministry. If some type of assault or sexual harassment of an adult happens, it's a little bit different. Then you have to see more closely. Sometimes we will say they cannot go back to ministry, but in each case we have to make a decision. Curable, there's never the guarantee that somebody is not a risk. So it's more being able to say, if they work on this, if they understand why they did it, they're able to admit it, they're able to demonstrate different behaviors, well, then maybe we can give them an inch. Again, not if they've abused a minor or not if it's been more serious, but more when there's been, you hate to say this, but something that seems a little less egregious. Okay, maybe we can look at that and see why it happened. Curable, that's a very difficult question to answer.
And it's a difficult word and a difficult topic, but I'm so grateful that you've shared so much with us. And we hope that we've all been able to learn something from this discussion on this difficult topic. I really appreciate you being here with us.
Oh, thank you, Montse.
This book is so critical.
Yes.
You're basically talking to the church about how we're supposed to talk about ourselves to others.
Next, a conversation with Catholic law professor and author Helen Alvarado about her new book, Unraveling How Catholics Can Best Advocate for the Faith. An on-the-record interview when we return.
The culture is obsessed with sex, and the church is responding.
Helen Alvarado, Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University, shares insights into the challenges the church faces and the answers the church should have in our increasingly secular society. Welcome back to EWTN News In Depth. Demands for Catholic schools, hospitals, and other healthcare providers to provide abortions, transgender surgeries, contraception, or affirm employees in same-sex unions are threats to religious freedom in the United States. Professor Alvarado's new book, Religious Freedom After the Sexual Revolution, discusses how the church can draw on scripture, theology, and empirical evidence to counter laws mandating cooperation with many states' new sexual orthodoxy. She joins us on the record.
Helen, thank you so much for being with us to discuss your new book. Why did you write this? Some people say you're a very religious woman, but I also know you to be incredibly culturally apt.
So I wrote this book as a service to the church. Sometimes people will say to me, oh, Helen, you're so religious. Everything you do is for the church. And I think to myself, what is the proportionate response to, a God who made everything and then died gruesomely to save us and gives us the gift of our life and everything on the planet. And my vocation is as a scholar, so this is my giving back.
Let's talk about the one big decision from this year that it feels like changed everything, but didn't change that much. The Dobbs decision. You submitted a brief on behalf of women talking about how abortion really hasn't given us everything.
Yes. The brief was 240 women, all with what we call terminal degrees, JD, MD, PhD, to prove pro-lifers are smart, because we continually seem to have to prove that to people, to say, as against Casey and Roe, that claim that abortion is the crucial path to women's freedom, it has not been. And here, empirically, is my proof of that.
It's incredible. And then knowing that you shared that wisdom with the court and the voices of all of those women, then you get a decision that overturns Roe. How did that make you feel?
I was both overwhelmed at its historic significance. I was very proud of the United States. That was something I didn't expect to feel. Here we are, this economic powerhouse, who also has the wisdom to protect unborn life. The opinion was such perfect constitutional common sense. A respect for democracy and the people who wrote the Constitution and voted for it, which is us,
right,
through history, that I just sort of had of course, it's beautiful, it's sound, it's intellectually good.
Let's get into your book. I think you've spent the last 10 years fighting the contraceptive mandate and talking about sex. I like to say sex and nuns. You diagnose the culture as seeing the church as sex obsessed.
Yes.
Is the church obsessed with sex?
The culture is obsessed with sex, and the church is responding. There's this really cool author who's written a book on the Catholic Church and homosexuality, Father Louis Camelli. And he says, listen, for like the first many hundred years, the church talked about Jesus, human and divine, how is that? Then we were all like, oh my gosh, there's three of them, the Trinity. And then he said, we turned our gaze on ourselves. And today, we've turned our gaze on this part of ourself, that is our sexual self. And we've made it, as a culture, the obsession. The church is responding to this because there are so many laws and regulations bearing down that we have to respond. We didn't create the fire, we're trying to calm it.
And in trying to calm it, we make a lot of mistakes. Because we don't, as you described, actually talk about who we are and what we do and why we do it. And you give us a lens, a really important one, the two greatest commandments as the lens through which we should be funneling this response.
Right. So people think that our response about sex is moralism, self-made rules to decide who goes to hell, basically. Instead, we draw our teachings not only on care for immigrants, feeding the poor, but also on sex, marriage, and family, from the same great commandments, love of God and neighbor. And I point out, frankly, that if we really want to take a Good Samaritan lens and care for those strewn on our path, we actually have to start with the boyfriend or girlfriend we do or do not commit to sexually, the person we marry, the child we conceive, and do we or do we not bring them to birth, the child we conceive, and do we or do we not give them a stable mom and dad in their lives. Can you think of any more Good Samaritan behavior that affects other people indelibly, deeply, probably for the rest of their lives, than these decisions about the people strewn in our path? I try to put together the social justice agenda and our thinking on sex, marriage, and parenting as one piece, married under love of God and love of neighbor.
Because it is one piece.
It is one piece. And the church tells us that we have to come to understand who God is, how he loves us, and how we love one another through the lens of men's and women's relationships and parenting. Otherwise, why the references beginning to end of the Bible about God as the bride and we as the bridegroom, about God as the father and we as his children who must love him like a child loves a parent.
The place that religious liberty has now in the church and allowing us to counter the sexual revolution is a complicated one. Why did you give that division, legal and cultural?
So long as these leading challenges to religious freedom come from sexual expression laws, contraception, abortion, same-sex relations, transgender identification, when we make our religious freedom case, sure, we can talk in the language of the court, church autonomy, ministerial exemption, burden on free exercise. But if we don't make simultaneously the case for why the thing we want religious freedom for, to safeguard children's well-being, to secure marriages, to provide children loving, committed parents their whole life, if we don't say what our religious freedom is for, then our case for religious freedom and our teachings about the family will sink together. I was really struck that I was not seeing in more legal contests involving like Catholic institutions wanting to feel free about hiring and firing employees. I was struck that no one had really amassed the expert literature on what an employee means to the institution keeping its mission. I found the Catholic Church often using some thin ministerial exemption language. The organist picks the music for the children's liturgy, thus he is a minister. Oh my gosh, no. The organist or any other employee is part of a community that's supposedly gathered in response to Christ, who is supposed to make Christ present in our life today. He promised he'd be with us forever. That means you manifesting him. And who was supposed to give the world, this community, a glimpse of the kingdom of God on earth. What will it look like when Christ is all in all?
Helen, you've given your career to fighting for the church, but you also know that the sins of the church are real. A lack of compassion or a perceived lack of compassion, sexual scandals, financial transparency, all of these things are manifested in the culture. Monsignor Shea had a beautiful quote where he said that our church takes on the sins of the culture and shows us how to deal with them in the same way that Christ took our sins to the cross and saved us from them. Is this why you wrote your book?
I did want to make the case that despite acknowledging a church that sometimes doesn't even believe in its institutions what I described to you. They've lost hope, or they're tired, or they're trying to please some hospital accreditation or educational accreditation agency. That as often as we have sinned, we haven't lost the beautiful patrimony that Christ gave us, and we still have something to offer. And I say, and I think to people, you have to be brave. We deserve the slings and arrows. I headed up a sex abuse investigation in a diocese. I know. We deserve the slings and arrows. We apologize. We're flawed. We have original sin. We still have something beautiful to offer. And you have to stand there and be shot at and say that at the same time.
That's a beautiful way to close. Thank you so much, Helen.
Thank you.
While church leadership in the U.S. combats laws that would force Catholic institutions to neglect church teachings, church leadership in Belgium is doing the opposite, actively working to change church doctrine, defying the Holy See. That controversy and what it could mean for the future of the church in Europe is next in the Week in Review. Open defiance of the Vatican tops the Week in Review. Bishops in Belgium on Tuesday announced they will bless the unions of same-sex couples. Cardinal Joseph de Kezel of Mechelen, Brussels, and several other bishops published a document titled Being Pastorally Close to Homosexual Persons for a Welcoming Church That Excludes No One. It contains suggested liturgy for the blessing of same-sex unions, including prayers, proposed scripture reading, and parts in which the couple can express their commitment to one another before God. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says the number of men and women who have deep-seated homosexual tendencies is not negligible. This inclination, which is objectively disordered, constitutes for most of them a trial. They must be accepted with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Every sign of unjust discrimination in their regard should be avoided. While the Church is sympathetic to the cross the LGBTQ community must bear, Pope Francis has also stated that he cannot bless unions of same-sex individuals because he could not bless sin. Our EWTN colleague, Father Elias Leids, joins us from the Netherlands to help us understand what is happening in the Low Countries. Father Elias, thank you for being with us. We first saw defiance from bishops in Germany, with church leaders there blessing same-sex unions, and now we're seeing it in Belgium. Is this a domino effect or contagion?
Could be, I don't know if I can really help you much in understanding this thing, because for me it's sort of very strange. I still have trouble in understanding it, but there's no doubt there's a consequence. The Germans, with their very impressive synodal path, may have given a hint. I think it's also rooted in maybe a cultural confusion between devotion and sentimentality. Belgium is a country with a long Baroque history. We in the north don't have that history. They were a Catholic society during several centuries where the church had no real competitors. And I would say that the Baroque past is manifested by a greater, I would say, sentimentality, sentimental aspects of the way they live their faith. And I think what just happened is also a sign of that. We've had in the north, we've had our synodal path. We had a sort of it was called a pastoral council in the 60s, which accelerated everything in such a way that all what we are seeing now in Germany and in the north of Belgium, it's the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, we just, as Catholics in Holland, at least the ones that are left, we shrug our shoulders and say, we've seen this before. It will lead nowhere. So the domino here is not going to fall.
And so the history of the church teaches us that in church time, this might be a blip. But Belgium consists of both French and Flemish-speaking peoples. Yeah. Is there a growing divide among the clergy there on this issue? Does it fall along cultural and linguistic lines?
I don't know. It's difficult for me to say, because there is a very deep-rooted cultural difference between the two parts of Belgium. And I would say that maybe the Catholic Church is an instrument for unifying the two. It should be, and it has been, when their King Boudewijn, who really was serving as much as he could both parts of Belgium, when he refused to sign the abortion law. That was, I think, a very beautiful day in the history of the church, and it showed that really the king was serving this unity. So I think the church should not emphasize the division, but should try to bridge it.
Right, bridging unity from the church. And then how are the faithful responding to this?
I don't know. The Catholics that I know and that we are cooperating with EWTN, they're surprised and they're startled. And I think those who take their faith seriously, especially the priests, they will feel betrayed, because I've been welcoming homosexuals. I've been merciful to them ever since I'm a priest. And the fact that I tell them the teaching of the church and I help them to live their life in let's say the traditional wisdom of the Catholic Church,
in pursuit of God.
Yes, it doesn't make me less welcoming and less merciful. And it's my experience. It's my experience that if you assume that they come to see you as a Catholic priest who tells you the Catholic teaching, then you're really serving. And they know that. I've had a lot of these people in my confessional. I've served in the biggest prison of Lithuania in Eastern Europe. I know what I'm talking about. I'm sorry, but to bless these kind of relationships, it leads nowhere, and it's a betrayal of souls. For political reasons, for whatever reasons, it's a betrayal, and that's the way I feel it.
And you may feel it that way, but we haven't heard any response from Rome. Why do you think that is? How long will the Holy See wait to speak out on this growing trend that could lead to schism?
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know why Rome doesn't say anything. And, there's a lot of speculation about this. Some people say the Flemish bishops, it's the north of Belgium, it's the Dutch-speaking bishops. The Flemish bishops have done this with the green light of Rome, because actually next week they're going to Rome for their Ad Limina visit. Some people speculate that they did get permission from Rome, and others say, no, they're just trying to provoke Rome. They're just, trying to provoke something in Rome when they go there. I don't know. I just don't know. Nobody really knows. It's very confusing.
Well, we can pray for that visit and that the Holy Father will share his wisdom with them. Thank you so much, Father.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
A vigorous condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine during the annual United Nations General Assembly gathering of world leaders this week. Representatives from multiple countries addressed the global damage the war is causing and called for accountability for alleged atrocities and war crimes. In a speech to the assembly, President Joe Biden said Russian leader Vladimir Putin was responsible for egregious violations of the UN Charter and international law.
The United States wants this war to end on just terms, on terms we all signed up for. That you cannot seize a nation's territory by force. Ukraine has the same rights that belong to every sovereign nation. We will stand in solidarity with Ukraine. We will stand in solidarity against Russia's aggression, period.
Meanwhile, Ukraine is pushing for the creation of a special tribunal to prosecute war crimes. In Russia, unrest this week as President Putin announced a hurried mobilization of 300,000 reservists to replenish its troops. In a rare sign of public dissent, Russians protesting the military operation in Ukraine and troop call-up were arrested and hauled away. The call-up is the first in Russia since World War II and appears to be deeply unpopular. There are reports of vehicle backups at the border and packed airplanes as many men of military age try to flee the country. A high-profile prisoner swap between Russia and Ukraine occurred this week after months of delicate negotiations. Ukraine announced the exchange of 215 Ukrainians and foreign fighters. 200 of them were for a single person Russia wanted, a high-profile friend and ally of President Putin's. Among the freed fighters were several Ukrainian defenders of the Mariupol plant who held off Russian troops during the long siege of the city. The United States Marine Corps paused punishment for Marines who refused the COVID-19 vaccine on religious grounds, thanks to a temporary order from a federal court. The Marines are the third branch of the military, along with the Air Force and Navy, to face an injunction over refusing religious exemptions for vaccines. The vaccine mandates for the military led to thousands of military personnel being separated from duty. The Marine Corps leads the military branches for the most separations. According to the court order, more than 3,000 Marines requested religious exemptions from the vaccine, and only 11 requests were granted. Roger Gannam, Assistant Vice President of Legal Affairs with Liberty Counsel, the group responsible for the lawsuit that led to the court order, explains that these injunctions allow servicemen and women to continue serving their country.
We've gone to court because the military across the board would just simply refuse to give a real process of accommodation to religious objectors. And now court after court has confirmed that to be true. And with these preliminary injunctions in place, we hope that the military will start to change course.
The injunction or protection lasts until January, when this case goes back to trial, to determine whether the protection will be made permanent. The current injunction only applies to Marines who requested a religious exemption. Service members who have already been separated must wait until the trial ends for reinstatement. An estimated 1 million homes remain without power in Puerto Rico in the wake of Hurricane Fiona that made landfall last Sunday. The storm toppled power lines, crumbled bridges, and dumped 30 inches of rain, leading to catastrophic flooding and landslides. The Federal Emergency Management Agency sent hundreds of employees, including urban search and rescue teams. Catholic Charities, the National Guard, and other organizations are organizing distribution of food, water, and other essential items. Puerto Rico is still recovering from Hurricane Maria 5 years ago. When we come back, some closing images from the funeral of Queen Elizabeth.
Go forth upon thy journey from this world, O Christian soul, in the name of God the Father Almighty, who created thee.
Next, a final farewell to a queen, as we're reminded of the faith journey that guided her life and provided the bedrock for the country and commonwealth she led. The world has said its goodbyes to Queen Elizabeth II, but her life in the heavens is just beginning. She was a devout queen, both personally and as the head of the Church of England. And as we close today's program, we bring you images from her state funeral on Monday, where her relationship with God, her faith, and her service to her people were celebrated as a life well lived. May God grant her eternal rest.
With thanksgiving, we praise God for her constant example of Christian faith and devotion. Commend Queen Elizabeth to the care and keeping of Almighty God.
Let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also.
Her late Majesty famously declared on a 21st birthday broadcast that her whole life would be dedicated to serving the nation and Commonwealth. Rarely has such a promise been so well kept. In 1953, the Queen began her coronation with silent prayer, just there, at the high altar. Her allegiance to God was given before any person gave allegiance to her. Her service to so many people in this nation, the Commonwealth and the world, had its foundation in her following Christ, God Himself, service in life, hope in death. All who follow the Queen's example and inspiration of trust and faith in God can with her say, we will meet again.
We give thanks to God for Queen Elizabeth's loyalty to the faith she inherited through her baptism and confirmation and affirmed at her coronation, for her unswerving devotion to the gospel, and for her steadfast service as Supreme Governor of the Church of England.
We entrust the soul of Elizabeth, our sister here departed, to thy merciful keeping,